On this episode of The Unselects, rules for thee
and not for me. Welcome to Massachusetts politics. I'm Brian Costello.
And I'm Greg Richards, and we are The Unselects. Okay, Brian, still have a lot of unknowns about this SJC decision in relation to the MBTA Communities Act. We still don't have any feedback from the governor on emergency provisions and so forth and so on. But as of today, Shrewsbury is in full compliance because there is no guidelines that are in place.
That is absolutely true.
All right, great. We do want to go here. First video, let's take a watch. Just about the news coverage of the SJC decision, another clip. And there's actually a familiar face on here who we both actually know. So let's take a watch.
It's been nearly a year since voters in Milton rejected a plan that would have complied with the state's new zoning law. Now, the state's highest court has upheld the MBTA Communities Act.
So we do see it as a victory.
However, the court also ruled that the state did not follow proper procedure in setting up the guidelines for how 177 communities served by the MBTA should redraw their zoning maps to allow for higher density housing. The court says until the state does that, the law is not enforceable.
And this may require additional time, but it does not in any way stand in the way of a municipality working to come into compliance, which is mandatory and made crystal clear by this decision today.
Governor Healy's office said new guidelines will be ready by the end of the week and effective immediately after that. But Milton resident Denny Swenson says she thinks coming up with new guidelines will take months.
And that's going to involve public hearings that are posted in the newspaper, et cetera. There's going to be many of them because it's 177 towns.
Since Milton rejected its MBTA communities plan, several other communities have done the same.
So there you go. Once again, very clear that the guidelines are thrown out. And actually, the Attorney General did say, well, it may take us a little time. But then, of course, it says, the governor's going to declare an emergency and they're going to roll this out by Friday and they're going to immediately become effective. So yeah. I'm confused because both of us do actually happen to know Denny. We've spoken to her. She's a very nice woman and she's done a lot of work for all the communities in Massachusetts. So I do want to give a shout out to Denny because she's done great work on community advocacy around this type of thing. So what is your thoughts on the comments there by the Attorney General?
Yeah, and I will say that probably when the election comes up, she'll be the former Attorney General. But I think that obviously she has to spin this as a win. Mm-hmm. However, you can't enforce an unenforceable law. And in the SJC opinion, it basically says that. Sure, the law is constitutional. Right? But the law's teeth, everything about the law was in these guidelines. So when she said, but you still have to comply, technically I can't comply because there is no compliance language. Right? So she's just kind of all wet in that regard. And I do agree with Jenny in the fact that while the governor may try to promulgate emergency rulings, I think that'll be challenged. And I also think that the SJC was very, very clear.
Absolutely. So one of the things I want to go to here is I want to kind of go back. There was a conversation the Attorney General has. They have this Ask the Attorney General on WGBH. I don't want to show this because I always think it's important. She's actually going to be talking about the law in general. And I always find it interesting that I always feel the people who are in charge of enforcing things often don't even understand what they're talking about. Because let's listen to how she defines the MBTA Communities Act and make the determination if we as Shrewsbury would be subject to it. So let's take a listen.
You know, one of the things we did learn from this election, cost of living is a huge issue for people across the country, and particularly here in Massachusetts. Cost of housing is huge. Under the Baker administration, we had this MBTA communities law, which said around T-stops, people were going to make up plans to build more housing.
And so you had a Republican governor, obviously Governor Baker, a Democratic legislature that came together and said, we need a mandatory policy, not a volunteer policy. If you have the public, if you have the T in your community as a public good, you have an obligation to build more dense housing in order to be able to help us with this housing crisis.
Okay, so number one, this housing crisis about housing. Number two, it said there, if you have a T stop in your community as a public good, you have the obligation to build dense housing. I don't know how those correlate, but do we have a T stop in our community?
Shrewsbury here?
That's right.
Let me think. No.
Okay, so then would we have an obligation to build dense housing?
According to the Attorney General of Massachusetts, no.
I know, exactly. So that's why I think this is big misnomer. It's like you put a law out there, you're advocating on its behalf about how amazing it is. It's like you should just tell people that we want to jam as much housing down your throat as we possibly can, and then they know they just wouldn't get support. So we're just going to somehow do this big, giant, random correlation to the MBTA to say, well, how do we get more communities to do it? Oh, we'll tie it to something that affects 177 out of 351 towns. And then therefore, that's how we're going to get this thing to have some teeth. But fundamentally, once again, that's not really what the law says.
And more importantly, if you look at, again, the ruling, the SJC kind of focused on these small amount of communities. I think it's 14 or 15 that actually get trains through the stops. I can't remember how many it is, but it's not a lot.
Yeah.
Right? And in the original law, while it says MBTA community, it primarily talks only about the half a mile from a station. Right? And then there'll be guidelines, right?
Well, I think that those towns are the ones who are on the actual like blue, green, orange, red line.
Right.
Not the commuter rail.
Not the commuter rail.
And the intention was, okay, well, we could mitigate some of the commuter traffic to ensure that as many people as possible, or we can get people around Boston a little bit further away into housing, and then they can access, employment in the city. And like we've talked about it before, a lot of people don't commute into Boston even from out here anymore. There's a huge 495 corridor business.
Yep.
And it really is, there aren't that commuter flow is not what it used to be. And that's why the T suffers today, because ridership is so far down, especially after COVID, that things have changed completely about who are their customers and who is actually riding the T, correct?
Yeah, exactly. And even if you look at it, you take maybe from Worcester to Boston, right? Worcester is seeing a growth spurt, right? They've turned around, it's almost a renaissance in some areas. Those downtown apartments that they've built, a lot of people from Boston are saying, hey, Worcester's not so bad. It's better rent than downtown Boston, right? Still high, but better than Boston. There are instances where it makes sense to build high density housing.
Absolutely.
Right? It should be up to the community, not the state from on high. It should be up to the community saying, hey, we want to grow. We want this. And some towns, Grafton, for instance, I feel bad for. Grafton has one stop. It's a small town. Being forced to build a lot. It's sort of crazy.
It is. So one thing I think people don't know, because I'm going to go to this slide, she talked about this whole, hey, you have this public good, which is stop. We don't have a stop, but guess what? We pay for it. And I want to show that real quick on our budget. There's two things that we do pay for on a yearly basis, the MBTA and the Worcester RTA, so regional transit there. So we're paying $176,000 and $120,000, so a total of almost $300,000 a year, just for what? No, I have no idea what. We don't have a stop. I mean, the WRTA at least does service Lakeside Commons. I think there are some stops that come into Shrewsbury, but the MBTA itself, I have no idea, but yet we're paying yearly. And could those funds go to something else? Absolutely. Are we really getting a benefit? I don't see it. Maybe I'm missing something.
Yeah, I think we should probably ask the town to get an audit of what that money is used for. Why do we pay it? What's the bill look like? Right? I'm sure we raised our hand and said, let's give you money. What does it give us? Because I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's just a math exercise. They just take the communities, and there's probably some math exercise, and they say, yep, this is what you owe us, and good luck trying to audit that one.
Yeah, with the Worcester Bus Company, look, they have stops in Shrewsbury. I have no issue with that. Maybe it's a little too high. I'd look at that. What's the ridership look like? Or is it the same 4 people? I don't know. But I think we should still look at all of this. But you can at least make an argument. There's some base service.
Right. Absolutely. I want to pivot here and go look at the governor herself. She is commenting on Keller at large here about the MBTA's Communities Act. So let's get her take on kind of where it stands and her opinion on some of that.
This past fall, when the SJC heard arguments about the MBTA Communities Act, the justices seemed to have very mixed feelings about whether or not you're entitled to a court order to compel cities and towns to go along with the housing mandate that is part of the Communities Act. If they rule that you can't use that tool and can only withhold access to state grants, what's Plan B?
I feel really good that we're not going to need a Plan B because communities are already doing this. And I want to be clear, this isn't a housing mandate. It's a rezoning mandate, right? It doesn't actually require construction of homes, but it does require communities to work to rezone so that there's potential for
open
more
the door
housing.
for it,
Exactly.
yep.
And the good news is we've got over 100 communities already signed up and in compliance.
She's lying again about that number.
Yeah.
At the time, there's not 100 communities in compliance. They're in compliance that they submitted plans, but did not have finalized plans submitted to the state that were approved by the EOHLC.
Yeah.
And the only reason the communities are signing up is because they have to. She's making it out like people are jumping on the bandwagon. This is so amazing for them. It's such a big help. This is, I think, one of the other really frustrating things you see with government. It's they mandate things and say, you have to do all this because I want you to. And then they pat themselves on the back to say, look at all the compliance we got.
Yeah. I'm going to threaten to sue you.
Right.
But, do what you want.
Yeah, it's like, I'm going to come and arrest you unless you do this. Okay, well, I'll do that. Well,
And I just
look
don't
at how
believe,
great you did.
The straight face with, this isn't a housing law, it's a zoning law. I'm not an alcoholic, I just drink 30 beers a night. Right? It's a stupid argument.
It is a stupid argument. And that, I think she's trapping herself because now I'm going to say she's claiming this is an emergency, right? That somehow this is impactful to the lives of Massachusetts residents, like that are going to pass away if we don't get a zoning mandate in place. Like people are going to start just dropping dead on the street corners. I mean, it's crazy how they use that word. And I'm going to go right now because I want to piggyback off what you just said. It's a zoning mandate. Well, let's listen to the Mass Housing Partnership. Now, Mass Housing Partnership put together a webinar series throughout the compliance period here when they started the MBTA Communities Act.
The former compliance period.
The former compliance period. And I want to hear, let's listen to what one of their experts has to say about the law when it comes to what the intent is.
Yeah. I know this may not be what everybody wants to hear, but the intent of the law is to get housing built.
So what? Wait a minute. I thought we were just zoning. But the intent of the law is to get housing built, but we're just zoning. It's just a zoning mandate.
Well, that's what we heard in Shrewsbury, right? We heard everybody say, oh, it's not housing, it's zoning.
Right.
Which is as of right. And, I don't know if we're going to talk about this later, but I just want to bring up, and when you think about this, I was on the phone with Denny Swenson from Milton. She brought up the fact that since Lexington has actually created the zone, which, by the way, now might or might not be compliant because there is no compliance guidelines. Over 700 permits have been pulled. Whew. Right?
That is amazing.
If you zone it, they will come. It's obviously housing.
Absolutely. It's obviously housing. And you know what else it is? That's affordable housing.
Yeah, it's not affordable housing.
And I want to go and take the affordability piece. I'm going to go back to the planning board hearings, before town meeting, because I just want to talk a little bit about, remind people of what we really, put in place and how it really isn't ultimately affordable housing. So let's take a listen.
There is no component for affordable housing in this. Is that correct?
That's incorrect. We have the affordability component listed at 15%, which is the maximum that our economic feasibility analysis that we conducted would allow. Our local bylaw allows a fee in lieu, where a developer can pay a fee to the Affordable Housing Trust in lieu of units.
So that would not be a way in this new zoning of how it would be adopted here in town.
We had a question about fee in lieu of affordability. The fee in lieu option requires issuance of a discretionary special permit from the planning board. The provision remains the primary funding source of the Affordable Housing Trust as it stands. So our recommendation is to retain that discretionary permit option.
So a little nuance here. There was, and there is, I guess, in the bylaw that was passed by town meeting, a 15% minimum affordability. But to remind everybody, that's at what they call an 80% area median income level, which we've talked about, that effectively a two-bedroom house or two-bedroom apartments is about $2,000 a month, or maybe $1,700. It's not.
It depends, though. It goes up to that.
It does. It depends, yeah, and it's not what people truly believe is affordable housing. It's not deeply affordable or low-income housing. So it's really not that affordable. And our plan includes this fee in lieu that allows developers to opt out if the appointed planning board should such allow, to pay a fee into the Affordable Housing Trust, because, as he said, that's the primary source of funding, that they then have that money where they can go and either try to acquire land or or build something else in the community. So as a developer, I'd probably tend to take that option every single time if I possibly could.
Yeah, it makes sense, especially, obviously, all of these developers are for-profit developers.
Right.
They're going to maximize dollars. This law does not require affordable housing. Shrewsbury has the 15%, but I can vote. I can opt out of it. Then what will happen is, you're right, how much of that money has to go in before we can acquire and then build? I don't know what. What are we building?
I have no idea.
Are we building elderly housing? Shrewsbury only has 1 or 2 spots that actually have elderly housing, right? Because they keep saying under this law, oh, seniors and young people can't afford to live here. And they still can't. And under this law, they will not be able to afford this. Anything that goes up in that zone is going to be incredibly expensive.
Well, I think if you actually read some of the comments from the Attorney General and the governor, they're actually saying, oh, this is great. Now teachers and firefighters and nurses and all these people are now going to have access to all this housing. And I'm like,
no.
I'm still trying to struggle. It's not single family housing. Most people, as they get older, don't want to live in apartments. This is all about building apartments.
Yeah.
So one thing I do want
to take it a step further.
Yeah.
People like Healy and Campbell and many of the proponents of these kinds of transit-oriented districts, they've specifically stated in their position papers that they don't believe in single-family housing anymore. They don't believe you should have a piece of land with a house on it where your kids can play in the yard. That's actually anathema to people who believe everything should be Brooklyn, I guess.
I know, which is ridiculous.
Yeah.
So we're going to transition over here to the governor. She's going to be talking about those developers because I think it's important to talk about who really benefits from this law. And it is the developers. And we'll listen to the funding that she's siphoned from our tax dollars to those developers to allow them to do this. So let's watch.
I think that's why you see so many communities coming on board with planning for more housing. We've allowed ADUs, these accessory dwelling units. We're supporting transit-oriented development. Just this year alone, through the tax credits that I got done, we've given developers tax credits for more housing. And we've seen thousands of units in production as a result. That's going to be great for our economic competitiveness and great for the state.
Do you believe you've broken the back of NIMBYism?
Look, I grew up in a small town, and I'm quite familiar with NIMBYism, and but I have to say, I see more and more communities coming on board.
Once again, more communities coming on board because they have to.
I thought you was going to bust out in John Cougar Mellencamp there for a second.
And they, it does bother me the way that they talk about this because they take our tax dollars or residents' tax dollars, take them and give them to developers to allow them to build more housing, and somehow that we're going to be more economically competitive because we have tons of apartments all over the place.
Yeah.
And the other part of it is somehow by building all these apartments, that's somehow going to bring down housing costs. Now, the only way it would do it, if you saturate the market, this is what they're telling you is good for us. We're going to saturate the market with your tax dollars because we're going to pay developers to build stuff that's not economically viable otherwise. Yeah. We're going to inflate the supply. That's going to drop the price because there's going to be supply and demand. Then, because that is dropped, it'll also naturally lower the price of your home, reducing the equity you've put into it over the years, meaning that they're essentially funding your own demise with your own tax dollars.
No, you're 100% right. I'd even take it a step further. When that happens, in other words, let's claim a housing crisis to create a housing crisis, a legitimate housing crisis, i.e. you're tanking the real estate market. What's going to happen? Some people will say, well, that's good. My taxes will go out. No, they won't, because they're going to raise your tax rate at that point. Right? You'll never pay less, right? These towns, these municipalities aren't stupid. When your real estate tanks in value, your rate's going to go up, and you're going to be sitting there saying, I just lost a ton of money because my money was used to give to the cronies and friends of state politicians to build stuff.
Because that's exactly how they calculate the tax levy, just so people can be clear.
Yeah.
The town meeting passes the budget. That budget is used to calculate the tax rate based off the assessed value. It's a formula.
Yeah.
To your point. So you're never going to pay less. That's not how it works.
Exactly.
So we are.
If my house suddenly next year goes down. My house is, I don't know, I think everybody in Shrewsbury's seen such a huge increase in their assessment. Guess what? When that assessment goes down, when they overbuild, your tax rate goes up.
Right. I'm going to circle back here to what we started this conversation with today about the rules for thee and not for me. And the reason I want to comment on it, back on the questions on the November election, the first question on the ballot was about the auditing of the legislature, and that did pass overwhelmingly, like 70%, but all the legislature's upset about it, and they're trying to essentially prevent adoption and prevent implementation. Right. So there's a question here. What the Attorney General is talking about is the will of the voters as far as do they respect that? And the reason I want to mention it is because I'm questioning, right, based off her comments here, how does that relate to the way the SJC case and quote unquote creating an emergency set of regulations? So let's listen.
Do you support what the voters supported? Where are you now?
Well, I absolutely support the will of the voters and a more transparent government. I've been on the record on those issues since I was on the city council. There's no role for my office to play right now. We certified the ballot question. The voters spoke. I respect the will of the voters.
Of course they respect the will of the voters. Yeah. They respect the SJC. You know, we're not going to go back, though, and rewrite the guidelines because that would take too long. So we're actually just going to claim an emergency and push something through because we respect the rule of law, effectively is what she's saying. The other thing I want to go to here is I feel as though she could be talking to you as the lead petitioner in Shrewsbury. It's a good thing Needham got this done first because I think she would be talking to you in this case. But we're going to talk and listen to what the Attorney General says about her thoughts on voters like ourselves going to something and utilizing a referendum and whatever our town acts are to be more active in our democracy. Let's take a listen.
A lot of towns went along with it. Milton didn't. They objected to it. Now you get Needham objecting to this too. They're going to go to the polls to vote on a new housing plan. So is this going to happen? Are we going to get somewhere with this, or is this going to be one town after another after another?
Here you have a community actually where a bylaw was passed, and now you have a few residents who are upset with the efforts by local folks to actually come into compliance, but who are upset trying to stop that from happening. And I hope they don't. Because the last I checked, housing and affordability is the #1 issue that people are dealing with, and not just in Massachusetts, across this entire country.
By the way, in fairness, when you said a few people, almost 4,000 people signed the petition to get the voters. So there are a lot of people in Needham that are unhappy with what their town meeting did, right?
For me, that's a few people.
I can make up math. That's a few people.
Yeah, 4,000 people in one town said, I don't really like the plan here, but that's just a few people.
Yeah.
And, the other thing is, they were upset but because the town was trying to do something in compliance. Well, maybe she should think about, why are they upset? Is it how it's being implemented? What the parameters are? And like I say, they're just so disconnected from reality, or how dare anybody go against them kind of thing that, hey, we have this massive housing crisis of affordability. This is going to solve it, we guarantee.
By the way, that's not the #1 issue. If you were to poll, I think, people in Massachusetts, that actually wouldn't be the #1 issue. For her and her constituencies and the small group she hangs around with, it might be, but it really is not, right? People want to feel safe in their communities. That's a #1 issue. People want less costs as far as their food and everything else. That's an issue. Traffic is an issue. Things like that. But, housing, it's important, and it is expensive here. That's why a lot of people are moving out of the state, by the way. Right. And that's one of their pitches. Well, we want people to stay in the state. All right, then build affordable housing because this ain't it.
Right. Yeah, the whole thing is just a mess, to be honest. And the one thing I want to tie into here and move on to the next clip is, talking about that certain people were upset with the decision of, let's say, town meeting. And I think that's a reoccurring theme, not only in Needham, but I think you can see that here by our select board. I want to go to a clip here and some of the comments regarding correlating the town meeting vote to the stance that the select board has to support, let's say, affirming the decision at town meeting. So let's take a listen.
Town meeting, which is our governing body, and they overwhelmingly voted the amended motion 123 to 50, which I also believe that still should be affirmed given that's our form of government.
I always feel like town meeting has done the job of vetting and debating and making a decision that they feel is in the best interest of Shrewsbury. This needed to pass by a majority vote. It passed by 2/3, 123 to 50.
You know, we're not the only town that falls back to these town meeting decisions. And what I think the misnomer is, and we've discussed this before, is that town meeting effectively represents the viewpoint of their constituents in the town as a whole. And I just don't think that's accurate anymore. And I think there's reasons for that we've discussed. And my example is this. You go back to the 1995 referendum, all right? That town meeting vote passed 148 to 35, 81% in favor. However, when that went to the polls and everybody in town got to vote for it, the town voted 2,984 to 2,897 against. So 51% of the no, a complete flip-flop. So in that particular case, was town meeting really representative of that? Milton, same thing. Town meeting, 158 to 76 in favor of MBTA zoning, 67%. The entire town voted 51-15 to 43-46 against, 54%. Again, complete flip. Shrewsbury, we voted 123 to 50. We'll see what the vote comes out. But my guess is it potentially is going to be closer than what town meeting voted. And I think there's some reasons for that. Fair?
Yeah, I think, most people don't understand. There's a number of reasons why people are on town meetings, and a lot of them are there because they're concerned about their towns, obviously, and they want to participate. A lot of them are there because it's a thing to do. And we've talked about this a little bit, right? Town meeting does not necessarily represent the people. It represents some people who are maybe a little bit more engaged or just want to be there because it's something interesting to do and they want the ability to say they're a town meeting member. But I wouldn't say they're necessarily more informed than the average voter. They just have to show up at a meeting, as we know a lot of our folks don't, twice a year. But I think what ends up happening is town meeting represents a portion of people in town that should be representative. Most of our town meeting members aren't going out knocking on doors, sending emails to their constituents and asking how they should vote. That's not what's happening, right? So the average person needs to be woken up. And when they get woken up about issues, you'll see that almost consistently in towns that have these referendum elections. A lot more people than the town thought actually were against something or for something.
Absolutely. And I've seen it too. Back to your point, I've sent emails to town meeting members and that they're shocked. A lot of people actually respond because like, this is like the first time I've ever had an email from somebody asking me to vote a certain way.
16 years.
Right. And which is sad. And there's a lot of people don't get involved. But when they become aware, and you have to go back and say, is that an issue? If you go back even 30 years ago in 95, right, you had Moda Pala was still on there.
Yeah.
You had Donna O'Connor that was on there. People who are still around today in some form. And their statements back then were like, oh, we probably should, there's going to have to be some healing done around the community because of this contentious vote. And, maybe we should do a better job of communicating with the community and doing this and doing that. Nothing was ever done.
Yeah.
They never tried to improve, right? Over the 30-year period. And we had the same people, and the same people are still on town meeting. I mean, there's probably, I would say, what percentage of town meeting members
should look that up.
In 2025 versus 1995 are still there. The one thing, I do want to talk about here is too, they really talk about, this ties back into this whole concept of compliance, and that, the reason why we want to affirm this vote and we're recommending that people affirm town meetings vote is goes back to compliance. And I do want to throw out a concept here of this whole scarcity and abundance, because we talked about grants, right? We have the scarcity mindset of, well, every grant we have to go after because we never know when the next breadcrumb is going to happen or where the next dollar will come from, versus an abundance mindset that says, we're just going to do what's right and good things will happen to us as a community. And I just want to go show I did a little fun here. We have a little fun with the compliance concept, but let's just look between December 17th select board meeting and the January 7th select board meeting, the number of times the term compliance was used. So let's watch this little clip I put together.
I believe compliance is very important.
Compliance.
Compliance.
We've talked a lot about compliance.
I see compliance as the best path.
In terms of compliance.
Compliance.
Compliance is the best.
Compliant.
Compliance.
Non-compliance.
Non-compliant.
Not in compliance.
Non-compliance.
The non-compliant.
Not in compliance.
Not complying. If we focused on compliance.
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 We need to get them T-shirts. Compliance is the best.
Compliance. Oh man, I tell you, yeah, it's it's just.
But this goes back to I want to bring up critical thinking, right? If you're a critically thinking person, especially an elected official, you should have looked at this like the gentleman in Framingham that said, this is a guideline that was not promulgated in the proper fashion. We don't have to do a damn thing because we can wait.
Right.
Because I don't believe this was actually legal. Who was right?
He was right.
Right. Meanwhile, the compliance crew here, they should all get T-shirts, maybe wear little wigs or hats or something. They were wrong. They were 100% wrong. And I just feel, again, no mea culpa on that, but it's amazing to me.
Yeah, like I said, I want to have that. It's hard to get outside of it and have visionary thought when you're just thinking about protection.
Yeah.
And it's like you're huddled and how do I survive? How do I get that next dollar? How do I make sure I don't make any waves?
You brought up fear-based thinking.
It is.
Fear-based thinking.
It's not visionary. And how are you ever going to come up with or becoming and create, let's say, how do you create a community that is leading as far as for its residents or providing opportunities and things that other people haven't thought about? You don't do it purely complying to everything that somebody's asking for. I mean, do we really need 5 people to agree with everything that's pushed back? Like, why do we even have a board?
We can replace them with AI. That's
we
what I'm saying.
could,
We don't need.
We're done. Yeah. Right. We'll move on from the compliance thing quickly here. But the one thing I do want to talk about is a comment that was made, and we're going to talk about the intention of how Shrewsbury created our MBTA plan and the concept of minimum compliance and what we do in reality, and why I think a lot of these discussions that we've talked about, we always question, because I feel as there's some hypocrisy amongst there. So let's just take another look at a clip here.
I hear from people that you've had enough of the building. I get that 100%. And from the beginning, I think the goal of Shrewsbury was to meet and not exceed the required capacity.
So in terms of the special permit and allowing greater than 15 units per acre by special permit, typically what we've done in our proposals is set the cap where we can for by right uses, and then allow that special permit use for the board to consider projects at higher densities. What that does is it gives the flexibility for the community to evaluate through this process, through the planning board process, any project at higher densities if it's, if it meets the community needs.
You know what the community need was? To develop a plan that was minimally compliant. Yeah. That was supposed to be the intention. So when you say this was the intention, yet another department is not following along, I've never heard them say, hey, you know what? As we've decided, nobody's ever put on nobody ever had a whiteboard and said, our number one goal, here's what we commit to you as a resident. Our commitment is on this MBTA process. We will not create anything above and beyond what we absolutely have to, because nobody in this town really wants this.
Right.
However, here's why we think that compliance is the right path, but we will commit to you that we will not do anything above and beyond. Yet
we'll fight it every
way
we can legally, but
right.
Yeah.
But yet, I even questioned him in that meeting about that too. It's like, why do you tell people on one hand that this is just minimum compliance, but we're going to put all these provisions, whether it's, oh, well, you can get out of affordability by fee and lieu. Oh, well, we can build something bigger if it's in the community's interests.
And I think your work on that, if I'm not mistaken, it was removed. Did we remove that? Did they remove that?
He removed it they put a cap on it, but they opened it up and said it could be as big as they wanted. They said, well, it can only go up to 20 units per acre, and there were some limitations on what the planning board could do by special permit. So it was mitigated, it was not removed.
Yeah. And it is ridiculous, right? Because it does show hypocrisy.
Right.
It's, okay, is it minimum or not? Obviously it's not. You might not understand the word minimum. It's possible.
Yeah. The last thing I want to kind of get upon in this episode here is we want to talk about grants a little bit. And the reason we're not going to dig into as far as we know that now we have to have a compliant zone, But I think it's important for people to understand when they were talking about compliance and grants, what is the scope of that? What was really the dollar impact of Shrewsbury? What could it be? I think it's important to hit upon it quick. So let's just take a quick clip here from the chairman, John Samia, and then go into some budget numbers here just to give people a scope of what we were really talking about was at risk with non-compliance, let's say.
I believe compliance is very important. I'm worried about the impact of grants for 2025. If we're going to March, we may not be part of that cycle. We may, and we will not be able to avail ourselves of the many categories of grants that have been discussed.
We talk about categories of grants, going right into our budget. Shrewsbury's budget's $180 million. That biggest piece of the pie is what we talked about, like you mentioned, the tax levy. How much is the assessed value times our tax rate, tax levy. Utility revenue, local receipts, all these other things that go into there where you actually have things like excise taxes and, all kinds of other things. State aid is grant bucket there, almost 26 million. Out of the 26 million, most is school aid, Chapter 70, roads, Chapter 90. All
not impacted by MBTA.
100% correct. Those are all formula-based grants that do not go away. You start seeing how small of a piece of pie we're talking about here. Then you have general aid, which a lot of those things are specific. There's things like library funding and other things that come in. So we don't budget for grants, which we shouldn't. I guess that's the good thing. There's no slice there that says grants. But keep in mind, when you look at how we already go, where all of our revenues come from, there is not this giant slice in there that was like, hey, every year we have this chunk of grants. And if that slice went away, what would we do? $180 million, right?
Yeah.
We were talking about $500,000 here. We spent $300,000 on MBTA and the WRTA with what benefit? And, so we talked about, we might lose $500,000. One thing I think was interesting, I like to pull this one out. A lot of people don't know. We get $1.5 million from something I found is very interesting. We get $1.5 million from selling capacity of the landfill on Route 20 to Wind Waste Solutions, was Wheeler Brader at the time. So $1.5 million to bury ash from Saugus in Shrewsbury.
Is it just Saugus that pays that $1 million?
Well,
or other people too?
No, Wind is paying the $1.5 million.
Oh, I get it.
But the reason, I didn't go into this detail, but the reason why we take it here is that Saugus is actually, there's a lot of people upset because if you know where it is in Saugus, it's actually on the waterway up there.
Yeah.
And it has like grandfathered in permits environmentally. So the people in Saugus are mad that it's there. So they said, well, we'll solve the problem. We'll keep it running longer. We can keep it running longer by not burying it in Saugus. We're going to truck our ash all the way to Shrewsbury and we're going to bury it. We got 75 acres, I think, of ash that's buried on Route 20. We're going to have that through 2027, I think, or 20. I mean, they talked about it a little bit. I might be wrong in the timing there, but 4,500 tons per month, 25 tons per truck per day. Thank you very much, Saugus, for your trash that you burn. So they burning trash. Let me just get sick. We're going to burn trash. We're going to create ash. We're going to put that in a truck. We're going to drive that all the way to Shrewsbury, and we're going to bury it.
We're going to bury it. Yeah, Mount Trash, as a lot of people know it as in Shrewsbury. It used to be flat. It's now a mountain.
So we have to overcome that $1.5 million loss once we fill up our ash pits.
Right.
And are no longer to bury it there. But that's just to give people an idea of where money comes from. So when we throw these numbers out, it's $500,000. Well, we're going to have $1.5 million deficit at some point that we have to fill, and that's why we have to get creative. So we have to think about, as a select board, what are some visionary things we can think about from a revenue standpoint if we need it? Another question is, do we really need the revenue? What do we need to spend all this money on? Are we spending it on the right things? Or when can we be content? Or do we always have to be thirsty for the next buck?
And I think we should pull out, when we first met, we went through in a public meeting that we put together what these grants looked like, right? Most of them are, no offense, but sort of garbage grants.
Yeah.
That's actually a good garbage grant, I guess. But they were grants sort of like the feasibility to build something. It was always the feasibility to overdevelop the town. There's a couple in there that was like, let's get a sign, whatever, right? But to your point, none of these were actually that vital to the town, especially if you're thinking more towards, are we overdeveloping? Right. And if the answer is yes, and then you look at those funds, get rid of those grants. Don't apply for the grants that say, how can we get I don't know, a mall built here or something, whatever it is.
Right.
That's what those grants mostly look like.
Yeah, the two that I think I always brought up was wayfinding, like to your point. It was a sign downtown. And then the one about painting the electrical boxes, which are throughout. There's one at the library. There's one on Stony Hill. Yeah. And a lot of people go, like, why is that? That doesn't even make sense.
It should be a Boy Scout project.
Yeah. Why do we pay like $250,000 to paint these things?
Yeah.
Really? That's the good use of funds? So that's some in grants. So in summary, I guess I want to bring us back to where we started. All right. We still have a vote on February 4th. Now our belief is a no vote is actually in the best interest of Shrewsbury more than ever, because why would we agree to approve a zone or move forward with the zone based off no guidelines with nothing that tells us what the zone is supposed to look like? How could that possibly make sense for us as a community? So in your mind, Brian, what is next for Shrewsbury in the referendum process?
Yeah, so, they did certify and build the warrant for the date. Mm-hmm. In a perfect world, I would ask the town to put off the till May to the election. I don't know if that can happen. I don't think it can, sadly. But if it can, we should move that out, and then in the special town meeting, actually vote somehow to rescind this or change this, because there is no guideline. Voting yes on this creates a zone which may not meet the new guidelines, right? When that happens, I just want to be clear, we have created an as-of-right zone in our town that you just can't get away from anymore. To Lexington, good example, 700 housing permits pulled in no time, because these developers aren't stupid. They're going to jump in and they're going to build, right? Once that happens, because you approve this zone, which now might or might not be in compliance, now when the compliance comes along, the new guidelines come along, we might have to create another zone, right? We're in this weird period, right? So a no vote is smart because we're actually not non-compliant. There's no harm to this. There's a lot of harm to a yes vote, but there's no harm to a no vote right now.
Right. So we need to create a zone. That's clear. That's what the court said. We're not arguing that. But we need to do it in a smart way. And as Beth Cassavant said, minimum compliance, what does that look like? Until we have guidelines and we have new updates from the state on what that means and what we have to do as a community, we shouldn't put forth and put anything into place. So today, as we're sitting here, a no vote makes the most sense, more so than it did before the SJC case. And I think people might be confused by that if they listen to the news and the media. But those guidelines, as we said, is all the meat of the law. Without the guidelines, there isn't much left to 3A. That is the constitutional.
Especially that's impactful to Shrewsbury.
100%.
If I was in Milton, it might be a little different, right? Because they are a very, very specific MBTA community. But the guidelines that impact us are all gone. We should wait until they're back, not through an emergency declaration, which will be actually back in court, and it might go to court pretty quickly. And I think the emergency declaration would ultimately lose in the SJC, because this is very clear.
Very clear.
Go through the process, go through the regulatory process, which takes months.
So hopefully by the next time we see everybody on our next episode, we'll have some clarity. We'll know when we're going to vote. Maybe we've already had voted. Who knows? But really appreciate you watching. Reach out to us. It could be on Facebook. It could be at The Unselects, or contact at theunselects.com. And we'd be happy to answer any questions or dialogue around what your thoughts on this referendum are. So until next time, I'm Greg Richards.
And I'm Brian Costello.
And
we are The Unselects.